I stood at the edge of the riverfront pavilion, adjusting the tablecloths one last time and watching the sunlight glint off the water. Ethan's birthday party was finally underway, the air buzzing with laughter and the clatter of silverware as guests began to settle. I had spent weeks coordinating every detail from catering to floral arrangements, even hiring a local jazz trio for background music. It should have felt rewarding, but there was a knot in my stomach I couldn't shake. Cassandra, my daughter-in-law, drifted among the guests, her phone in hand, snapping selfies and checking likes with an almost imperceptible smirk. She always knew how to make herself the center of attention, and everyone else seemed happy to indulge her. My parents hovered nearby, subtly praising her every move while barely glancing at me. Their approval reserved for the family's golden girl. I forced a small smile, masking the frustration that had been building for decades. I thought about the years I had quietly managed the family's needs, the bills I had covered, the sacrifices I had made to keep everyone else comfortable while my own plans remained on hold. Nobody noticed. Or perhaps they did, and assumed it was my duty. This pattern had become so ingrained that even now, amidst the chatter and laughter, I felt invisible. I took a slow breath and let my gaze wander over the guests. Everything was in place, every detail perfect. Yet the weight of expectation pressed down harder than the Texas sun. Today wasn't just about Ethan, it was about proving, once more, that I could manage it all. But deep inside, I knew something had to change, and that realization made my chest tighten as the first words of Cassandra's inevitable speech floated toward me. From across the room, she raised her glass, her eyes glinting with mischief, and smiled in a way that made my jaw tighten, signaling that the moment I had been bracing for was about to arrive. Cassandra cleared her throat and raised her glass, drawing the room's attention. The chatter dimmed as everyone turned toward her, expectant for whatever dramatic announcement she had planned. She smiled, just enough to make it irritating. And then, her voice dripping with faux pity, she said, "Some people just try too hard to matter." The words landed like a hammer. Every eye in the pavilion shifted to me, family, friends, neighbors. Ethan glanced at me nervously, his hand hovering over his cup, unsure whether to intervene. My parents stiffened, their expressions a mixture of pride and discomfort, as if her words were clever but harmless. I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks, but I forced myself to remain composed. My hands tightened around my napkin, but my face betrayed nothing. A few cousins stifled murmurs. Some aunts and uncles exchanged glances. The weight of the room pressed down on me. For a brief moment, I imagined blurting out all the frustrations that had built up over the years, the unpaid bills, the late-night calls, the constant expectation that I should be everything for everyone. But I didn't. I held my tongue, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the tension to settle over the party, like a physical presence. The spotlight was unbearable, yet I noticed subtle cues. Cassandra's smile faltered slightly as she noticed the rigidity in my posture. She expected me to shrink, to make a self-deprecating joke, to let her words land without resistance. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched, my mind working quickly, weighing my options, calculating a response that would be precise, effective, and undeniable. I reached slowly for my phone in my purse, tucking it just out of sight. Everyone assumed I was distracted, that I was quietly suffering in silence. But the plan I had been rehearsing for years was about to unfold. And in those few seconds, the balance of power began to shift. As I sat at the head of the table, the hum of conversation filling the pavilion, my mind drifted to the years that had led to this moment. I had covered so much for Cassandra, her apartment rent, her credit card bills, the designer bags she insisted were essential. the weekend getaways she announced on social media with a grin that never reached her eyes. Each expense had been justified by my parents' gentle insistence that it was family duty. I had always told myself it was worth it, that helping her was helping the family, but the truth had begun to weigh heavily. My parents' voices echoed in my memory. "She's building something important," my father would say, his tone a mixture of expectation and guilt-tripping. My mother's softer coaxing, equally relentless, reminded me that I was reliable, that I could handle it all. I had learned early to nod, to smile, to transfer the money without question, even when it meant skipping my own bills or delaying plans I had hoped to enjoy in my later years. It had become a rhythm, almost automatic, to put everyone else first. And yet, as Cassandra's laughter rang out across the pavilion, I realized the imbalance had grown intolerable. I had been invisible for decades, the steady hand behind the family's appearances, the unseen pillar holding everything together. She paraded through the room, flawless and entitled, while my contributions went unnoticed, assumed, or minimized. The resentment that had been simmering quietly surged, tangled with guilt and doubt. Could I really act now? After years of compliance, could I allow myself to disrupt the delicate choreography of family expectations without feeling selfish or cruel? My hand hovered over my purse, where my phone rested. Ready. Every calculation in my mind pointed to one truth after decades of being overlooked. I had reached the moment where inaction was no longer an option. I exhaled slowly and slipped the phone into my hand, concealing it from view, the tension coiling in my chest as I prepared for the first step of what I knew would change everything. I lifted the phone from my purse with deliberate slowness, the weight of it in my hand grounding me. Every movement was casual, practiced. No one suspected that I was about to tip the scales that had been lopsided for years. My thumb hovered over the screen, ready to activate the app I had set up weeks before. A quiet measure of accountability that would expose what had gone unseen. Cassandra continued to circulate, oblivious, her phone lighting up with notifications as she documented every laugh, every toast, every compliment she received. My parents chatted in their corner, nodding at her words, satisfied that everything appeared perfect, yet their eyes flicked toward me occasionally, the old, unspoken expectation lingering I was to be the invisible support, never the one to draw attention. I tapped the phone once, carefully, and slid it back onto the table, letting my hand rest lightly near the edge of my chair. The effect wasn't immediate, at least not visibly. Guests continued to mingle, unaware, but I sensed the subtle shift, the faint tightening of lips, the brief hesitation in conversation. I watched Cassandra's brow twitch, a minuscule falter in her otherwise polished composure. Across the table, Uncle Thomas adjusted his glasses, and Aunt Margaret's gaze met mine with a barely perceptible nod. No words were spoken, but I understood the message. They recognized the move, knew its significance, and supported it silently. That quiet acknowledgement strengthened my resolve. Minutes passed slowly. The tension built imperceptibly, almost like a taut string vibrating under the weight of anticipation. I stayed calm, a mask over the surge of adrenaline and satisfaction stirring beneath. I had been patient for decades, biding my time, calculating every step until the moment was precisely right. And then, as I glanced up, I saw the first flicker of recognition cross Cassandra's face, her confident smile faltering just enough for everyone near her to notice. The first move had landed. The domino had been nudged, and the balance that had long favored her was finally beginning to shift. The ripple would spread quickly, and by the time the next seconds passed, The party would no longer feel the same. Cassandra froze mid-laugh, her phone slipping slightly in her hand as she glanced down at the screen. Her smile faltered, the confident mask cracking in an instant. I saw the color drain from her face, replaced by something tighter, more alarmed. Conversations around us stuttered, and a few heads turned in curiosity. Sensing a shift but unsure what had occurred, Ethan leaned toward me, his voice low, edged with disbelief. "Mom, what did you do?" I gave a small, measured smile, not breaking eye contact with the guests near me. No words escaped my lips. The calm precision of my stance carried more weight than any explanation could. The room seemed to hold its breath. Cassandra's eyes darted from my face to her notifications, realizing too late the implications of what had just appeared. The balance she had taken for granted for so long, the unchallenged assumption that I would silently cover every gap, every bill, every expectation, was suddenly disrupted. My parents shifted uncomfortably, their composed exteriors faltering. I caught the faint tightening of my father's jaw, the way my mother's hands clasped nervously in her lap. For decades, they had depended on me as the stabilizing force, the invisible one who kept the family machinery running. And now, for the first time, the machinery had hiccuped under my direction. Cousins exchanged glances, some whispering quietly, while the younger guests looked puzzled, sensing that the atmosphere had changed. Cassandra's husband moved closer, attempting to mask his concern with a forced smile, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He tried to intervene verbally, but the words felt hollow against the quiet authority I projected. I allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of what had just occurred sink in. No yelling, no accusations, no dramatic outburst, just a controlled presence that demanded acknowledgement. The room felt taut with expectation, the kind that forces people to reconsider assumptions, to take stock of the dynamics they had long ignored. Cassandra swallowed hard, her gaze flitting around the room, searching for allies where none could be found. Ethan's hand brushed mine, a quiet gesture of support. But it was unnecessary. The message was already clear. The disruption had landed exactly where it needed to, and the confrontation that would redefine the rest of the party, and perhaps the family itself, was only just beginning. Chapter 6. Backstory Revealed. As the murmurs around us swirled and Cassandra's expression tightened, my mind drifted back to the years that had brought me here. I remembered nights spent poring over spreadsheets, calculating how much of my own income I could divert toward her lifestyle without compromising my bills. Rent, credit cards, a new camera for her Instagram shoots. Weekend trips she demanded every expense had been silently shouldered by me. My parents' voices echoed in my head. "She's building her future. Viviana, you know how to handle it." Their words carried expectation, wrapped in guilt, reminding me that refusal was never an option. I thought of the family dinners where I would sit quietly as Cassandra recounted her successes, her influence, her flawless photos. While I remained invisible, Ethan would nod along, proud of her accomplishments, unaware that the foundation of her comfort had been built on my time and money. Even now, in this moment, the pattern of being overlooked and undervalued played out before me, amplified by the public stage of the party. But Cassandra was not without her own pressures. I remembered glimpses of her struggles late nights photographing content, responding to comments, the constant scrutiny from her followers, and the subtle judgment from our extended family. Her perfectionism, though frustrating, had roots in the same desire for approval and recognition that had governed my life in quieter ways. She had learned to demand attention, while I had learned to give it silently. That contrast sharpened my resolve. I realized that my decades of compliance had not been kindness alone. They had been endurance, patience, and strategy. Always calculated, always necessary. This moment, this subtle shift in the room, was the first time I could assert control without apology, without aggression, simply through the quiet authority of preparation and foresight. As Cassandra's gaze flicked toward me, searching for an explanation she could not yet articulate, I allowed myself a small, steadying breath. The years of unseen labor, of unquestioned responsibility, were finally accounted for. And the path forward was clear. The first move had been made, and now the confrontation I had long prepared for was about to reach its full weight. Cassandra's voice trembled as she stepped toward me, her confident facade cracking under the weight of what had just happened. "Viviana, you can't just," she began, but I raised a hand, a quiet signal that I would not be interrupted. Her eyes flicked toward Ethan, searching for support. But he only looked away, unsure how to intervene without escalating the tension. My parents leaned forward, their expressions a mixture of concern and exasperation. "Viviana, let's not make a scene," my father said, his tone tight with the unspoken reminder that I was supposed to maintain harmony. My mother added softly, "Think of the family. Just reconsider." Their words, carefully measured, carried years of implicit expectation that I would absorb the inconvenience, smooth over the disruption, and keep the peace at my expense. I shook my head slowly, letting my gaze sweep across the room, making sure all eyes met mine. "I'm done," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I will no longer cover Cassandra's expenses, handle her emergencies, or take responsibility for smoothing the cracks she leaves behind. That is not my job, and it never has been." The words landed with a weight that made the room shift subtly in recognition. Uncle Thomas straightened in his chair, his nod slight but resolute. Aunt Margaret gave me a faint smile, the kind that acknowledged both the injustice I had endured and the courage it took to speak. A few cousins exchanged glances, their whispers hushed but tinged with newfound understanding. Even some of my parents' friends, seated nearby, seemed to lean forward, registering the clarity and authority in my tone. Cassandra's lips parted, searching for a retort, but the words never came. Her husband stepped forward, attempting to interject, but the impact of my declaration left him momentarily silent. The room, which had been thick with anticipation and uncertainty, now hummed with the unspoken acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. I let the silence linger, letting my boundaries settle over the gathering like an unyielding presence. This was not aggression. It was authority, patience, and truth rendered visible. I felt the tension in the room relax slightly, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe without the weight of expectation pressing on my shoulders. The moment was fragile, charged, and irreversible. Cassandra's glare softened with uncertainty. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the family had no choice but to reckon with the limits I had finally drawn. The next ripple of consequences was only beginning to take shape, and I could already feel it reaching outward. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately after I spoke. Cassandra's hands trembled as she checked her phone again, the notifications making it painfully clear that her carefully curated image and carefully managed finances were suddenly exposed. Her confident poise faltered, and for once, the room saw her struggle without the safety net I had long provided. Guests whispered among themselves, glancing at her with curiosity and quiet judgment. Ethan looked conflicted, torn between defending his wife and understanding the truth he had only glimpsed in my calm authority. My parents sank slightly into their chairs, their expressions tight. Guilt flickered across their faces, unspoken, but undeniable. The realization that I had carried the burden for decades while they allowed Cassandra to remain dependent seemed to strike them all at once. Cassandra's husband tried to interject, his voice rising, but the words fell flat. He had relied on my silence, my compliance, to maintain the illusion of stability, and that illusion had just crumbled. She opened her mouth again, searching for a way to reassert control, but the room had already shifted. The subtle alignment of attention and power now favored the one who had long been invisible. I observed everything with a measured calm. No sudden movements, no sharp retorts, only the quiet acknowledgement of authority that had taken years to cultivate. Each glance, each gesture, each falter from Cassandra reinforced the weight of the change. It was not chaos, but clarity, a strategic correction to a dynamic that had long been skewed. Guests began to relax, sensing that the tension, while sharp, had a certain equilibrium now. The party continued, but it was different. Conversations were more cautious, laughter more tempered. Even the staff seemed to notice the subtle recalibration of roles, the unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of respect had shifted. I allowed myself a quiet, inward smile. This was exactly as I had planned, not humiliation for its own sake, but a necessary disruption to reestablish boundaries and accountability. The initial ripple had passed, but the full consequences would unfold in the days ahead. And I was prepared to watch each one settle in its proper place. The next chapter of reckoning was just beginning. In the days after the party, I felt a quiet clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I started redirecting my energy toward my own life, making small choices purely for myself, scheduling a weekend getaway in Austin, reorganizing my home office, revisiting the accounting projects I had postponed for too long. Each decision, however minor, felt like reclaiming a piece of territory that had long been ceded to the demands of others. Uncle Thomas called one afternoon, checking in with a tone of quiet pride. "You did what was necessary," he said. Aunt Margaret sent a brief note of encouragement, acknowledging what she had observed without needing to elaborate. Their support reminded me that my contributions had never gone entirely unnoticed, even if the rest of the family had taken them for granted. Ethan approached me cautiously one evening, a subtle shift in his demeanor signaling recognition. "Mom, I see everything you do," he admitted softly, and I nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without needing more. It was not a full reconciliation, not yet, but it was enough to validate that boundaries and honesty could coexist with connection. I also began attending to my finances with renewed attention, reclaiming control over accounts and obligations I had long managed for others. The sense of independence was intoxicating. Each decision reinforced my self-confidence, a reminder that I was capable, deserving, and no longer obligated to bear the weight of unappreciative expectations. As I closed my laptop one evening, reviewing the plans I had set in motion for both work and personal growth, I felt a surge of calm determination. For the first time in decades, I was steering my life on my own terms, and the consequences of the party had opened a path I intended to follow fully. The final chapter of reckoning was near, and I was ready for it. The days following the party felt different, lighter somehow, as if the tension that had shadowed my life for decades had finally lifted. I focused on my own routines, reviewing accounts, reorganizing my home office, and taking time for myself in ways I had long postponed. Each choice, no matter how small, reinforced a sense of autonomy I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Ethan approached me one evening, quieter than usual. "Mom, I understand now," he said, his tone hesitant but sincere. I nodded, acknowledging his recognition without needing further validation. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Thomas reached out as well, their support quiet but firm. confirming that I had acted rightly and that my boundaries were justified. Cassandra remained distant, adjusting to the consequences of her actions, while my parents showed signs of reflection and unease. Their discomfort was not my concern. My responsibility was to myself. I allowed the room to settle, emotionally and practically, knowing I had done what was necessary to preserve my well-being. For the first time in years, I felt fully in control, confident, independent, and unburdened. Standing up for myself had not required aggression or resentment, only clarity, patience, and resolve. I closed my laptop that evening, thinking of the future I would continue to shape on my own terms, fully aware that the freedom I had claimed was as much about survival as it was about dignity.